Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 12 in General Psychology. This is social psychology. It is one of those fields of psychology that kind of absorbs a lot of other fields, or a lot of fields were kind of born out of it. So it covers a lot of information. So we are only touching quite a few of the main topics a little bit, but social psychology has a lot more than just what we are covering here in class. So to begin with, what is social psychology? Social psychology focuses a lot on the social dynamics of our behavior, our cognitions, our thoughts. And so, really, it focuses on how our thoughts, feelings, and that behavior are influenced by the actual presence of others, the implied presence of others, or the imagined presence of others. So, actual presence of others, pretty easy to understand. I'm sure you can think of some examples. Actual people around you. So that is what actual presence of others is when there are other people around, we see that our behavior changes some. Imagined presence of others is kind of what this picture is getting at. This person might think ahead to what might people say? What do I imagine people will say about my outfit? What will people think about me? This is the imagined presence of others. Versus the implied presence of others, there might not actually be anyone watching you, but there you think that there might be, right? So a lot of the cameras in a store are like the security cameras are not actually cameras. They might be camera bodies, they might be the little like bubbles hanging there on the ceilings without cameras in them. Some of them have cameras, but not all of them do. So the idea that there might be a camera watching you, there might be a person behind that camera watching you, is the implied presence of others. So with this, one of the main areas of social psychology is attribution. Attributions are our assumption about people's motivation. So people are motivated to do things, and we as people like to try and figure out, why did you do that? Why were you motivated to do that? Why did you cut me off in traffic? These kinds of things. We try to make sense of it and figure out people's motivations. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. We tend to use either internal or external attribution. So internal are like the internal traits or abilities of a person. So the person who cut me off in traffic, I might say, well, they're just a jerk. They're always a jerk. That is their internal trait. That is why they cut me off. Or an external factor might be something like, well, they cut me off because there was a dog in the other lane that I didn't see. So they swerved around the dog. All right, that would be an external factor. An example here on the slides, well, maybe everybody did really well on the test, right? Maybe everybody got a very high score. And so I think, well, an internal cause could be everybody's really smart in class. Everybody has an internal trait of being super smart and doing really well on the test. An external cause could be something like, well, maybe I made the test too easy. So students were taking an easy test. That would be an external cause. So again, we oftentimes make this internal attribution. We'll talk about that in a minute. We also make attributions on if they are stable or unstable characteristics. So stable are things that aren't changing, or at least not changing quickly. So something like personality traits. Going back to my example of the person who cut me off in traffic, well, I think they're a jerk. I think that's a stable trait. They're always going to be a jerk no matter what. Versus an unstable characteristic is something like, this was just happening actually a few minutes ago. My children were being a little mean to me because today is a little longer till I get them dinner, right? So they usually have dinner about an hour before this, but on this day they're doing clubs and things like that, so they're coming home eating dinner late. So they're acting a little rude because they're hungry. So we call that hangry. It reminds me of the Snickers commercials when you're not you when you're hungry, that kind of thing. So that would be an unstable characteristic. Once they finish their dinner in a couple minutes, I'm sure they'll be very nice. So another thing we attribute causes to are either controllable or uncontrollable things. So again, we can control some things. We can control our emotion regulation. I can make dinner, so we can do things. I can feed myself if I'm getting hungry and I notice I'm getting upset. There are things I can't control. I'm not Storm, the X-Men. I cannot control the weather. I can't control if a dog runs into the road, right? So these are things that I can't control. But when we are thinking about why people do behaviors in social situations, we are oftentimes making attributions and thinking and trying to guess and assume, why are they doing that? With that, we oftentimes make the fundamental attribution error. This is our tendency as humans to overemphasize internal factors for someone. So assume that the person swerved into the road because they're a jerk. So I'm overemphasizing internal factors and underestimating the power of the situation. We oftentimes default to assuming that somebody did something because of them, because of something within them, some reason that they chose to do something, versus some external force pushing on them. Often like some social force, some dog running into the road that made it so they had to swerve into the lane. So with this, there is a study talked about in your book called the Quizmaster study, and it really shows that even when we know that there are external factors, we still have a hard time not falling into the fundamental attribution error and attributing people's behavior to some internal characteristic. So we'll watch this video really quickly about the Quizmaster study.
The Quizmaster study. Student participants were randomly assigned to play the role of a questioner or contestant in a quiz game. Questioners developed difficult questions that they knew the answers to, and they presented these questions to the contestants. The contestants only answered 4 out of 10 questions correctly. After the task, both the questioners and the contestants were asked to rate their general knowledge compared to the average student. Now, questioners didn't rate their general knowledge any higher than the contestants, but the contestants rated the questioners' knowledge higher than their own. In a second study, they repeated the entire thing, but had non-participating observers rate the knowledge of the contestants and questioners. In this study, observers also rated the questioner as having more general knowledge than the contestant. Of course, the obvious influence on the performance is the situation. The questioners wrote the question, so of course they have an advantage. The contestants and the observers knew this, but still made the internal attribution for the performance. They failed to make adequate allowance for the biasing effects of these questioner and answerer roles in judging the participants' general knowledge.
So this is kind of a funny example of people who knew that the questioners were making the questions. They knew there was something with the situation different than a standard, say, exam or something like that. The questioners are making the questions. They were randomly picked. The questioners themselves were randomly picked from the group, and so there should really be no difference. So the obvious influence is the external attribution, is something outside. They made the questions, they made hard questions, and that is why the questioners themselves rated the intelligence the same. So they're like, yeah, these were hard questions. I don't think most people would know them because they understand that. Versus the observers and the actual participants answering the questions, they made the fundamental attribution error. They overemphasized the internal characteristics of the questioners. They said, oh, these people must be smarter than us because, and also the observers, they must be the smarter people because they made such hard questions. We also have biases that we tend to assume our own mistakes, our own things that we do wrong are because of some outside force, and the things that we do right are because of an inside force. So this protects our self-esteem, and it allows us to diffuse that responsibility. It's some other thing. So you oftentimes, with sports teams, hear in, say, post-game interviews, excuses from people who were on the losing team. You'll hear them say, oh, the ice was bad, or, there was a lot of rain today, or the jerseys that we usually have didn't make it for this game, so we had to use backups. Like different things like this. So using an outside force to explain your own behavior. This is a pretty common thing. Also, you'll hear from the winning team, oh, our team played really well, we worked well as a team, we communicated, we worked hard, this is why we win, this kind of thing. So this is another example of when we are making incorrect attributions, and it's pretty common for humans. Obviously, we don't always do this, but it is a fairly common occurrence. Another common attribution that we make is towards people who have some sort of consequence. This is called the just world hypothesis or just world belief. You've probably also, well, you might have heard of the just world fallacy. It's all the same thing. It is pretty common in the United States. We tend to believe that people get the outcome they deserve. So, if it is someone who is homeless, the general attribution is that that person did something that they now deserve to be homeless. That it's not some outside force, it's some internal thing to that person that they deserve this. This can often lead to victim blaming. You might hear this when people are asked about, say, assault, for example. Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why were you wearing this? Or things like this are some of the examples of this just world belief. And again, it is a fallacy because it is usually not the case. For a person who is homeless, oftentimes there are multiple external factors, and it's and so with this, keep this in mind that we tend to make the fundamental attribution error. We tend to make self-serving biases, and especially in the US and other Western cultures, we tend to default to this just world belief that people are getting what they deserve. And this also goes the other way. If someone has a lot of something, if someone is very rich, that they deserve that because of how great or good they are at whatever it might be. With this, let's jump to social roles, social norms, social scripts. We've talked about scripts specifically, depending on when you're getting this chapter, quite a few times. It's very similar to the idea of a schema in cognitive psychology. Basically, a script is we know the sequence of events that should generally happen. You have a script of what will happen when I get to a stoplight. You have a script of what should happen inside a in-person college classroom. You have a script of what happens when I get to the doctor's office. These are general knowledge about the sequence of events. It takes less cognitive energy to have these kind of ideas or roadmaps for how to go through social interactions, but they can be wrong. And if something is off from the script, if you need to do something different, it can trip you up, make you take more cognitive energy to do that. Social norms, on the other hand, are the group's expectations. So, what are the expectations for how the group should behave, how the group should think, the things the group should do and say, maybe even wear, things like that. And similarly, the social role is more specific about a person. So, any given member of a group, what should they do within the group setting? What should they do for the group? So, you might, for example, have a social norm on a sports team. Let's take, say, a high school sports team. I played soccer, so let's use that. We might have a social norm that the team all does things together. We maybe listen to pump up music before a game. Maybe even when we go out for a celebratory dinner or something like that, we all kind of like sit together and hang out and talk, even if there are other people there that we know. A social role would be something like the team captain might have an expectation, or we all might have the expectation of the team captain for them to like charge us up or to be the leader even in a setting like in the restaurant. Maybe they're the one who like orders things for everybody, this sort of thing. That is social norms as well as social roles. So let's move on to attitudes. Attitudes are our basic positive or negative evaluation of an object or a thing or a person, anything that we could have kind of a positive or negative evaluation of. These can be very consciously thought up. Our attitudes can have a lot of data behind them, or they can be implicit. They can be something that we might not even cognitively recognize that we have. So think of some examples of attitudes you have towards or against things. So there might be a certain brand of car that you like or don't like. There might be a certain type of music that you have a positive attitude towards or a negative attitude towards. So think of some different things and write in your own notes about some examples. So, building on attitudes, cognitive dissonance is an example of a feeling that we can get or an experience that we have when we hold two different attitudes or two different ideas together at the same time. And the reason that this can be a problem for us is because we don't like feeling this stress. We don't like feeling the stress of having new things that we've learned not line up with past things that we've learned. We might have some preconceptions about how things go in a situation, a group of people, a type of vehicle, and then if we learn something that conflicts with those ideas, we might feel cognitive dissonance. And so it is an uncomfortable feeling, it's aversive, we don't want it, and so we want to get rid of that cognitive dissonance. So here's an example here. You might have an idea, a cognition in your mind that I'm a smoker. You smoke cigarettes, but you also have the cognition or idea and even attitude towards smoking is bad for your health. So with that, you might consider, well, both of those don't really go together. They're inconsistent. Humans in general like to be consistent, to see themselves as consistent, and to not feel the stress of knowing, I know this is bad for me, but I do smoke. What am I going to do about this? It's a stressful, anxious feeling. We often want to ignore or avoid this dissonance, and so we do a couple different things about it. And that discomfort is caused by those two different attitudes, thoughts, beliefs at the same time. Some common things that might lead to cognitive dissonance. If you've ever changed religious beliefs, you probably experienced cognitive dissonance. Maybe you were a religion and then later on you weren't. Maybe you grew up in a religion, but now you're not. You probably experienced cognitive dissonance as you took on different ideas or thoughts or values than you had previously. If you ever changed your political ideology, this is another example of a time people commonly feel cognitive dissonance. Maybe you were a specific Democrat or Republican, and then you learned some information or learned some various facts that didn't line up with your preconceived ideas. And so you felt a little uncomfortable about that. Maybe over time you changed to be a different political ideology. So you might have been a Democrat and now you're a Republican, or you might have been a capitalist and now you're a socialist. These types of things, with that experience shifting from one to the other, you probably felt cognitive dissonance at some point in that process or multiple points in that process. So, how do we deal with the dissonance? We want to get rid of it. We don't want that anxious feeling. There is a particular level of stress that humans can perform well under, but we like to reduce that stress. And so we are motivated to get rid of this dissonant feeling, this discomfort. So let's watch this video about how we often go about that.
Chances are good that you've heard of something called cognitive dissonance. It's a term that's starting to get thrown around a lot these days. But you might not know that it has a really deep root in classic social psychology. In 1957, Leon Festinger wrote a book on the theory of cognitive dissonance and outlined a really detailed understanding of what cognitive dissonance is and how people deal with it. Let's start out by talking about what cognitive dissonance is. How would we define it? At the very basics, cognitive dissonance is about inconsistency. When we hold two thoughts that are inconsistent with one another, basically, that's dissonance. So let's take the example of someone who smokes cigarettes. Here's a person who might have two distinct thoughts, one of which is, I regularly smoke cigarettes. The other of which is the knowledge that smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Here are two thoughts that a person can be having at the same time, acknowledging both of these things as fact, but they would seem inconsistent with one another. If you know that smoking is bad, then logically you probably wouldn't be engaging in that activity yourself. And so this is a case of dissonance because there's inconsistency in your own thoughts. So what do people do when they experience cognitive dissonance? Well, there are a few ways in which Festinger said that you could resolve the inconsistency as a way of resolving the dissonance. First, you can change one of those thoughts. So in the case of the smoker who realizes that smoking is bad and also that he is a regular smoker, he might change one of those beliefs and go, smoking's not that bad. It's actually not unhealthy to smoke. That would be changing one of your cognitions, one of your thoughts, as a way of restoring consistency.
So before we go to the next one, I want to give an additional example of changing a thought. Let's use an example of, let's say you are just learning about nuclear power. So you learn that nuclear power is highly efficient and it can produce a lot of power, but then you hear about nuclear waste and you hear about it possibly and nuclear accidents. And you say, okay, so nuclear power sounds really good. Maybe you had a thought of this would be good to do. And then you learn, oh, the nuclear waste and potential for danger is high. And so you might say, have a dissonance there. Again, for things that we're just learning, we'll probably feel less dissonant. For something that's very central to you, like if you were a religion, that would probably cause a lot more dissonance, a lot more of this uncomfortable feeling. If it's something that you're just learning now, like you just barely learned about nuclear power, probably wouldn't be much dissonance. But let's change the example a little bit. Let's say you've been taught in your sci or your science classes that nuclear power is really good. We should use nuclear power. So that's what your assumption's been for the last couple of years. Then you hear, oh, hey, nuclear waste is a thing. And also sometimes nuclear power plants have accidents or problems. And so now you might feel some dissonance there. So you can change one of those thoughts, right? You could change the idea of saying, well, maybe nuclear power is not all that I cracked it up to be. That could be a change of thought. Or you could say, you could maybe learn some more and see, oh, nuclear waste is much less harmful than, say, the waste from coal and other fossil fuels. And so you're changing that thought that the waste is not actually this green glowing goo that we often think about cartoony wise, that the nuclear waste is not actually really a problem. So you are now changing one of those thoughts. Then you can be consistent again. And we'll use this example for the next couple examples in the video as well.
Consistency. Another thing you could do is change your behavior as a way to restore consistency. So in this case, the smoker might say, well, if I acknowledge that smoking is bad, then the way I can be consistent is to stop smoking. So changing one of the behaviors that's related to the inconsistency.
So before the next one, so changing a behavior, probably none of you have a nuclear power plant that you are part of or in the workforce for, but a behavior you might change is maybe you were donating to some organization that is supportive of nuclear power, and then you learn about waste and you say, oh, maybe I'm no longer going to donate to this cause, right? Something like that would be an example of changing a behavior. So it's not quite as direct as the example in the video of stopping the smoking, but you could change behaviors and then feel more consistent. You would probably also at the same time be changing some of your attitudes if that was your change of behavior.
Related to the inconsistency. Another thing people can do is to add new thoughts into the mix, thoughts that help rationalize the inconsistency. So someone might say, yes, smoking is bad. Yes, I smoke regularly, but also I do a lot of other healthy behaviors. I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and I exercise a lot. So I'm adding new thoughts as a way to reduce the problem of inconsistency.
And you could see how adding a thought might also help lead to changing thoughts as well. So for the nuclear power plant example, maybe you add the thoughts of, yes, there is nuclear waste, but I've also seen how they store nuclear waste, and it's very safe, it's very contained, it's no longer radioactive, it's much less waste than other things. These are all additional thoughts that might make that original dissonance. Nuclear waste exists, because nuclear waste does exist, right? But it's changing our thoughts about that by adding these new thoughts of how they dispose of it is totally safe, totally appropriate, and now our dissonance is gone.
Consistency. And finally, people can just trivialize the inconsistency completely. They can just say, you know what? Sure, smoking's bad, and I smoke, but I just don't care. And that's going to be it. That's not really as big of a deal as people say that it is.
So as for the example of nuclear power here, you could either trivialize the first thought, say, okay, well, yeah, it's a problem, but there's not that many nuclear power plants in the world. Most people aren't trying to make one. So, it's not actually this big of a deal. I don't have to care or think about this very much. That would be one way to trivialize. Another way to trivialize is when you learn the information, like wherever you learned that information about nuclear waste from, maybe it's some crazy uncle that you have, and you say, well, crazy uncle is not actually a very reliable source of information, so he's probably wrong. I don't need to worry about this. So I'm now trivializing that inconsistency. Or you say, oh, I read that from this news report. That news station is not a reliable source of information. They have these biases, so I don't need to even think about that as an idea. So again, this is a way to reduce that cognitive dissonance. So the main ways that we deal with cognitive dissonance, some of those were talked about in the video, but changing those attitudes, adding cognitions, altering the importance of the discrepancy, saying, oh, this difference is really not that important to me, or it's very important. Reducing perceived choice. So, yeah, I'm not happy about nuclear power or nuclear waste, but, there's nothing I can do about it. that kind of thing. So letting it kind of leave your mind, making self-affirmations. Well, this is a problem, but I'm doing all these other healthy things. I put solar power panels on my roof or something like that. So making self-affirmations. I am a good person for the environment, or also changing behavior. So donate to causes that support or don't support the nuclear power. So as a quick aside, nuclear power is great. A very common assumption is that nuclear waste is a big problem. That's not what this class is about. Feel free, if that's a dissonant idea to you, to go and look up some peer-reviewed research. There's some good videos about how nuclear waste is actually handled and what is actually done with it. So feel free to take a look at that. Just as an example, I think it was a pretty good one. I hope to show the different ways you could do this. Resolve the dissonance, I mean. So with these attitudes, these positive or negative evaluations, we tend to do these things automatically. So in our implicit attitudes are automated, are activated automatically. These are outside of our self-conscious awareness. They're kind of simple gut reaction evaluations. They're things we've kind of learned over time, or we've got brain networks that are kind of running these implicit attitudes in those neural networks without our conscious awareness. Versus explicit attitudes, these are ideas or those positive or negative evaluations that are consciously held. Like we've actually thought of something. So, what is your actual evaluation of nuclear power? Is it positive or negative? Probably you have some consciously held, chosen decisions around nuclear power. I've got explicit attitudes towards and against certain car brands, for example. Um, so I really like Mazdas. I don't really like Nissans, but that's because I had a very unreliable Nissan, and my Mazdas have been very reliable. So these are not, maybe not careful and deliberate in that specific example, but it is a consciously held bias that I have. This attitude that one I hold kind of a negative evaluation for, and the other I held a positive evaluation for. For certain things like car brands, probably not a big deal. But when you have an implicit attitude towards, say, a ethnic group or a gender or a religion, then it could lead to your interactions with people from that group to be different in some way, oftentimes maybe even negative. So again, these implicit attitudes are outside of our conscious awareness. So if you have a kind of negative implicit attitude towards any ethnic group, you're probably going to be interacting with them slightly different, maybe slightly negatively. You might not see it. You might not realize that you're doing it. For example, you might have an explicit attitude that you are not at all racist, that you are a person who just is even anti-racist. So you might have an explicit attitude of anti-racism, but still hold implicit attitudes that a certain ethnicity is any kind of negative stereotype. And we'll get to stereotypes in a minute. But those implicit attitudes, other people might be able to notice that maybe you treat a certain group of people a little bit differently. So even though it's not a consciously held thing, you might even consciously hold the opposite idea. These implicit attitudes can affect us. And so with this, do you know any of your implicit attitudes? Pretty much no. These are unconsciously held. If you see people's behavior or people reporting to you that you're acting differently towards a certain object or group or something like that, you can maybe pick up on implicit attitudes. But no, they are outside of our conscious awareness. So there are some ways we can learn about our implicit attitudes. We can do something like an implicit association test. So this is a link to an implicit association test. I will navigate to it really quickly and show you a couple of the different things you can look at in implicit associations. So here we've got a lot of different implicit associations tests. This is for different presidents. Are you do you have more positive or negative attitudes towards specific presidents? Do you have attitudes that you're not aware of around transgender people? Do you have implicit attitudes about people's skin tone, about people's sexuality? Which is, there's one I did the other day. This one I was like, I'm not sure what this one is actually talking about. This one was really looking at, do you characterize white or black people as more dangerous, is the implicit attitude this one is looking at. And so all of these can help you figure out, do you have an implicit attitude? So if this is something you would want to know about yourself, because you really can't change these implicit attitudes unless you are consciously aware of them. By doing this kind of test, you might gain some self-understanding, know a little bit about yourself, the prejudices that you might have that you're not even consciously aware of. And one thing to know with this whole chapter, with these subjects that we're going to be covering, people can't take those steps to overcome prejudice and discrimination without first being able to recognize that they have these kinds of attitudes. So even if you have an explicit attitude of, say, anti-racism, it's possible that you have some implicit attitudes. So thinking about these attitudes, these positive and negative evaluations, if we have stronger attitudes towards something, we're more or less likely to behave towards that attitude. So if I have very strong attitudes towards liking Mazdas, I'll be a lot more likely to buy a Mazda. If I don't care, if I've got very weak attitudes towards any brand of cars, it's not going to change my behavior as much. And the more you're aware of your attitudes, the more like you are to behave as well. Also, if the attitude is something really close to yourself, so a vested interest, so if the attitude is really central to your identity, to who you are, you're a lot more likely to act on it as well. So again, this can be towards things positively, negatively. These kinds of features of how humans behave could lead to positive interactions or negative interactions as well. So this is also a big part of the theory of planned behavior. You can see attitude way up here. We also see subjective norms, which if you've read your book, you've seen it's a little bit forward in the slides, but we did have a little bit of subjective norms. So the norms, the ideas of people around you, the general expectation of thoughts and behavior, that's subjective norms. And then perceived behavioral control is something we haven't seen yet. It's essentially what it says. So, do you think you have control over your behavior towards this thing? These are three components that lead you to be more or less likely to do some behavior. So this is your intention to behave. Maybe that's intention to do pro-social behavior, intention to vote, intention to buy a Mazda. And then that is very closely linked to your actual behavior. But that intention, that I think I will behave this way, is not 100% related to this behavior, and we'll see why in a second. But that intention is made up of these things, your attitudes, the subjective norms, and your perceived behavioral control. So let's use voting as an example here. Maybe your attitude is very positive towards voting. Maybe you think voting is useful, voting is good, voting works, and that is your attitude. But let's say the subjective norm of the people around you is the opposite of that. The subjective norm is that voting is not useful, voting doesn't work, voting will not matter. So these are kind of contradictory. So that will kind of not entirely cancel each other out, but essentially you can measure variables and turn this into an equation of what's going to be the likely intention and then what's going to be the likely behavior. So if you've got positive attitude saying yes, go vote, negative subjective norms saying no, don't vote, and then it can come down to this perceived behavioral control. So do you think you have control over your voting behavior? Here in Washington, we can get mail-in ballots. It's pretty easy. You need to take some time to do it, obviously, but it's not the same as, say, other states where you actually have to physically go to a polling station. So let's say you were in a place where you had to go to a polling station. Maybe your perceived behavioral control is low because it's like, I'm not going to be able to get off work for that. I only have like half an hour in between these two scheduled things, so I really don't think I'm going to be able to vote. So that together will probably mean that even though you've got positive attitudes towards voting, you've got this negative subjective norm and low perceived behavioral control, your intention to go vote is probably going to be pretty low, and so the end behavior is probably that you're not going to be voting. So if we take that in another example, so let's say you have very positive attitudes towards voting, and this time you've got high subjective norms. People around you are like, yep, voting works, voting's good, voting is a useful thing to do. So you've got positive subjective norms, and then perceived behavioral control, like, well, I just need to take a little bit of time to mail in my ballot. So I have high perceived behavioral control. Well, all those together will make it so your intention to behave is very high. right? You have a high intention to go vote, so most likely you're going to vote. And you can use this kind of calculation for any behavior you can think of. So the behavior can be something like opening the door for someone. The behavior can be something like, are you going to buy that new thing during Black Friday? Or something like that. So you can look at what is your attitude towards the thing? What's the subjective norms around you? Do these line up? Do these not line up? And then what about your perceived behavioral control? Does it line up with these or not? And these are related to one another, right? If you have subjective norms one way, it can change your attitude. So that's part of what this arrow is. And if you don't have control, that can also change your attitude and change the subjective norm. So let's use that example of voting again and show what the more recent theory of planned behavior, the newer model. So here, I'm going to flip back and forth a couple times. We've still got attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control, but we see that there is some more pieces. On the back side of this, there are things that lead to subjective norms, that lead to perceived behavioral control, and another piece down here in between perceived behavioral control and the behavior. So we've added behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs. So these are the beliefs about the subjective norm. Do you actually agree with the subjective norm? Do you not? The control beliefs, do you have like positive or negative associations of your perceived behavioral control? These things also influence the attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. Another mediating variable is your actual behavioral control. So let's say, for example, you live in a place with polling stations that you have to go and vote at a polling station. So whether it's a library, a big city hall, whatever it is, but you have to go to it. So let's say your attitude towards voting, very high. Subjective norms, very high. You're like, I'll be able to go. I don't actually have work that day. I have a bunch of hours off, so I'll be able to vote. So your intention to vote, very, very high. You're getting ready to vote. You go to get in your car and you've got your car doesn't start. Your car is broken down. You can't get it to start. So that would be an example of actual behavioral control. You can't actually get there. So in the end, even though your intention was very high, because the actual behavioral control was low, you couldn't actually do the behavior, so you do not vote. So actual behavioral control can come in here and mess up that intention to behavior, but in general, our intention to behave, what we intend to do, is very related to our actual behavior. This is why I created the intended heroic behavior scale. I was getting at this piece. So what is a person's intention? Do they think that they would act heroically in a variety of situations that I asked them about? So with that, in creating the questions, I thought about attitudes, subjective norms, perceived behavioral control, and made questions that kind of got at all of this bit so that we could get a clear score on a person's intention to behave heroically. And I'm now in the process of testing. Does this intention actually line up with actual behavior? So we'll see what those results are. But you can, again, use this kind of map to map out any kind of behavior that you have. All right, with that, we will talk a little bit about attitudes and persuasion. So we've been talking about attitudes for quite a while. How do we change our attitudes? Or how can someone else change the attitudes? So persuasion is just the process of changing attitudes towards something based on some form of communication. So there are two main ways that kind of break down into more specific ways. So the central route and the peripheral route. The central route is a lot more highly cognitively intensive, more logic driven. So let's say you're wanting to buy a car. Let's say you're wanting, yeah, let's use the car example again. So you're wanting to buy a car. You could take the central route and look up gas mileage statistics. You could look up reviews. You could go and sit in the car, see which ones are more comfortable. You could look at information like reliability reports for that car brand. That would be an example of the central route. You're getting communications about the vehicle. Peripheral route would be something like, I saw Mazda's old Zoom Zoom commercials and I thought they looked cool, so I got a Mazda. That would be peripheral route. Not analytical, low effort. It's persuaded by cues outside of the message. Cool music, fun videos, Zoom Zoom slogan, still really good slogan. I wish they used it more now. But with that being said, it is a form of persuasion. So the central route generally will lead to a longer lasting change in attitude. Like since you've thought about this, you've considered this more directly, your attitude changes more long term versus temporary change in attitude might be all you need. A lot of fast food commercials, for example, are for temporary changes in attitude. And a big part of that is, hey, if someone's hungry, maybe they see this commercial and they will be more likely in those 5 minutes to be like, hey, let's go to McDonald's or let's go to Burger King or let's go to Taco Bell, right? Something like that. They don't need a long lasting change in attitude from their short advertisement. They need a temporary change in attitude. So, and this also depends on how people might be persuading you to do something or to be involved or to make some certain choice. A lot of them are either the central route, more analytical, or peripheral route, less analytical. So the peripheral route, rather than focusing on again, the facts or the quality or data, something like positive emotions, celebrity endorsement, a cool slogan like Zoom Zoom, clearly worked on me. So here are a couple really great, pretty recent studies on attitudes and persuasion. So this study, they basically used an emotionally charged pro-social message versus a threatening message about staying in and self-isolating during COVID. So they gave some people a message that you need to stay in because you're going to get sick, you're going to die, you're going to kill other people. So very threatening, very kind of scary, versus a pro-social message of, hey, you should self-isolate because this is going to help your grandma. This is going to help your family. This is going to help us all get over this quickly. Um, so with that, they saw that that pro-social emotionally charged message was a lot more effective. And this tends to be the case. We see a lot of times threats might be motivating, can be persuading, but generally overly so pro-social messaging, positive emotions can overall lead to other longer term drastic changes as well. But we can see this in things like so at the time I'm recording this, we just had an election. So we can see a lot of political messaging that tries to either be threatening or emotionally charged and pro-social. So you can see this kind of persuasion being attempted. Here's another interesting one. This was looking at climate change and action towards climate change. And the idea was, well, maybe reading fiction, reading stories about climate change might affect attitudes towards climate change. So in this specific study, I believe it was pretty short stories, and then to see if they reported different attitudes after. So like a pre-test, post-test, they read a little bit. Oh, and it looks 1 month in. Then they followed up 1 month later, it looks like. So yeah, this one was pretty short stories though, I believe. But there's other ones too that are looking at both movies, so movies that are related to protecting the environment, and longer books around protecting the environment to see if that does change attitude, beliefs, and even behaviors. So even with these short stories, it did show a short-term positive effect. And so this is actually one thing that I'm using in some of my interventions as well, is things like stories of heroes, stories of pro-social behavior, positive things like that, and reading even fiction about it, testing to see, does this lead people to actually take pro-social action? It would be kind of interesting if even a Batman or Arrow or Daredevil comic or something like that, or Wonder Woman would lead to some more pro-social action if they saw that in those stories. So something I'm testing. This is another one that was really interesting. Rather than taking that central route and really having someone consider something like climate change directly, they tried to use adaptive framing and change people's central route thinking, but kind of in a peripheral way for climate change. So rather than saying specific messages towards the environment or climate change, they were trying to persuade people who were already skeptical of science to take climate action. So in this kind of case, they gave messages, they gave persuading like central root messages of you can change things, you can adapt to new lifestyles or new things that happen to you. So trying to keep anything out of it that was specifically about science, trying to keep anything out of it that was specifically about environment, but trying to send the message through the central root that you as a person can adapt. Things change, you can adapt, you can shape your own destiny, you can do things. A lot about self-efficacy, really. And what they saw is that even though they were going through the central root trying to persuade someone of that they can change things, they can adapt, you can shape your own destiny. What they found is that it did also work through that peripheral root of these are correlated, these are related. That ability to change and adapt leads people to be more likely to have behavioral control for climate change, environmental protection, and things like that, which was pretty neat. So a couple of good examples of research on persuasion and what it looks like today versus what we talked about just a minute ago. That was kind of like the starting point and some basics. But yeah, let's go now to beliefs about social groups. And this is what I think one of the most important components of this lecture here in chapter 12 is our beliefs about social groups. So in groups are the group we belong to. So I'm part of a family, I'm part of Olympic College. So the groups that you belong to are your in group. You can think of probably quite a few groups that you belong to. If you're on a sports team, that's part of your in group. So an out group is a group that you don't belong to. So them, the other people, the other group over there. So that can be an ethnic group, it could be religious, could be anything like that, gender. So think of examples of in groups that you belong to in your own life, some people that you see as out groups as well. And with this, we oftentimes, with our in groups and out groups, make assumptions about members of the social groups. A lot of times these are learned from others. This could be parents, the social norms around us, media. And what these stereotypes do is they help us think faster about people. So we have these kind of premeditated judgments or biases based from these attitudes and our previous learning that can cause us to ignore information that doesn't fit a stereotype. And this isn't necessarily always a bad thing because this does help our brain work faster, right? So our brain takes a lot of energy from our body. It's what about like 20% of our oxygen and our calories are devoted to our brain running every single day. So that's a lot compared to the brain's size is like 2% of our body overall. So that's a lot of energy for the brain. So this kind of thing, having these heuristics, these scripts, even these stereotypes can help us interact with other people quickly and easily. If I'm in the store and I'm looking for mint chocolate chip ice cream and I see someone down in the hallway that works there, I can tell they work there because I have my scripts about how stores work. And this person might be someone that I feel is an outgroup to me, right? They might not be the same as me, and so I don't have to know everything about the person. In this quick situation of asking them, hey, where is the mint chocolate chip ice cream? Are the stereotypes I have of them really going to harm them or me? Probably not in a lot of situations, but they can potentially have dramatic harms. And so this is kind of a two-edged sword. Are this assumptions that we make about people, these basic, easy judgments we make of them that run through our default brain networks because we've learned this over time, we've developed these attitudes over time. It's easy for our brain to make these assumptions. So in a lot of situations, it does allow for us to have pretty quick, easy social interactions. I don't have to know that worker's life story, right? I don't have to understand everything about them in this situation from my example. But it can lead to a lot of potential harm. If I am seeing that person as less than me, it could lead me to make decisions about them. Maybe the way I interact with them, maybe the way that I vote, maybe the way that I treat them outside of the workplace could lead to a lot of negative. So we also have an outgroup homogeneity effect. We oftentimes assume everybody in that outgroup is all the same. So let's say we are in a group and we all play Halo, or we're in a group and we all play Dungeons and Dragons. So there's definitely some overlap between those groups. But let's, for now, pretend that these are totally separate groups. That the Dungeons and Dragons group and the Halo playing group are totally separate. Oftentimes, our assumption is people in the other group are all the same. So all Halo players are like this, or all Dungeons and Dragons people are like this. So that is the outgroup homogeneity effect. Again, This helps us just navigate our social world with less cognitive energy, but that can lead us to make a lot of incorrect assumptions and decisions, and even harmful assumptions and decisions. So this can lead to prejudice. We've alluded to this quite a few times now, but the specific definition of prejudice is the unjustified attitude towards a group, suggesting that they deserve some inferior status. So oftentimes we're talking about this as directed at race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, or socioeconomic status. But the main idea is that we could, and we often do believe that any given group might deserve some sort of inferior status. That is what prejudice is. And so the reason this picture is here, I had a class that most of them didn't know what this was from. So this is a picture of, feel free to look up some other YouTube videos, since you're probably viewing this on YouTube through Canvas, about Mr. Rogers and stepping in the pool with a black man. So at this time in history, Mr. Rogers was seen as an example to a lot of people, shared a lot of good ideas. People looked up to him, shared the things with their kids on PBS shows, so public broadcasting. So it was going to a lot of people's houses on TV. And at this time, it was seen as inappropriate for a white person to be in a pool when there's a black person in the pool as well. So they didn't have a budget for a full pool here on this set, but they took a little kiddie pool and they both relaxed and rested their feet. Mr. Rogers with this other black man who he talked to as an equal. So you can find the actual clip of this, and this was a really big thing on TV at the time. This had a lot of impact, even measurable impact on people's attitudes towards the black community. And it was a big step in trying to fight and reduce prejudice. So that is why that picture is there. Feel free to go and look into it in more detail. As another side note, PBS is and their shows are actually one of the highest researched forms of media. Since it is a public broadcasting, there's a lot of evaluations. So the government's like, well, should we keep spending money on this? Is it doing any good? And there's actually a lot of research on it, and a lot of the changes that they make, they research it and then make those changes. So it's actually a really great thing that I hope continues to exist for a long time. But yeah, if you didn't know about that story, it was an attempt to try and fight that unjustified attitude towards this ethnic group. So with this, we do have causes for these prejudices. Oftentimes it stems from competition between groups. So especially when resources are scarce or we feel that resources are scarce, it is a lot easier for us to rely on our in-group and focus on the out-group as a to fight them, or to that they want our resources, that they want our cookies. You may have seen some memes like that. So this kind of natural in-group bias might also add to that and lead to the development of prejudice. Again, if we have parents with prejudice, if we have social norms around us that have these prejudices, again, these develop over time. They can also be stemming from these in the internal attributes or the internal attributions or judgments that we have of people versus the explicit. So I'm not using the right word there. It's not coming to my mind right now. So implicit attitudes versus explicit attitudes. So those kind of implicit attitudes, as well as having parents with prejudice, as well as having social norms around you that are prejudiced, make it very likely to develop these prejudices. And again, these cognitive shortcuts that we use can lead to errors, right? So our outgroup homogeneity effect might assume that everybody from that community, everybody that is in this group, everybody that plays Dungeons and Dragons, everybody that plays Halo is such and such a way. And that leads to errors in prejudice. And prejudice can also lead to discrimination. So discrimination is specifically the negative or patronizing action towards those outgroup members. So it is the behaviors. So again, prejudice is building on these attitudes. So again, implicit prejudice is harder to change than explicit. I guess I should have just gone to the next slide when I couldn't think of the word implicit and explicit. But yeah, these prejudice are these unjustified attitudes. So we might have implicit unjustified attitudes or even explicit unjustified attitudes. It is also possible for us to have explicit be explicitly, let's say for this example, anti-racist. We could be explicitly anti-racist. We don't believe that we're racist. We think racism is very bad, but we could still have implicit prejudices. This is why things like the implicit association test are really good. So we can see, hey, do I actually have running around there in my brain some implicit attitudes that might be leading me to treat, say, anybody in this picture differently? And then discrimination is the behaviors. So are we doing patronizing actions? This can be anything from um, ignoring verbal abuse, just teasing people, all the way to murder, right? There's a wide range of behaviors that are discriminatory. And that being said, attitudes don't always predict behavior. So you might have someone who's prejudiced but doesn't actually act in a discriminatory way. It's not one to one, but it is a pretty good predictor if someone's prejudiced that they might be more discriminatory. So people also do discriminate without being aware of it. Like I said, one way you might find out about implicit associations is that people comment on, well, why do you act differently with this person versus this person? Why do you act differently with your trans friend than your cisgendered friend? Why do you act differently with the black neighbor than your white neighbor? You might not realize it. You might even have explicit attitudes that are anti-racist, right? But you might have implicit attitudes that lead your behavior more than you might be aware of it. So we have groups. We have in-groups, we have out-groups, we have these cognitive shortcuts, and they can help us. They can be very useful. They can improve self-esteem to be part of a group. Being part of a group can oftentimes lead to a lot of sense of identity, people around us that we can bounce ideas off of. They can be really, really helpful, but they can also lead to dehumanization. They can lead to prejudice. They can lead to discrimination. So how do we decrease these negative things and increase the positive effects of groups and our social psychology? Because while a lot of the social psychology started with investigations into why does XYZ bad thing happen? Why do humans do XYZ bad thing? We can also use this social psych knowledge to essentially hack us to do good and do positive things in the world. So that is what the next story I want to focus on is about, the rattlers and eagles. So to start off with this, it does mention it, but it really briefly mentions it in this video, that in this study, the researchers basically made a summer camp. And so at the summer camp, they had a bunch of young men. They were 11, 12 years old. It'll clarify. But the main idea is that all of the kids who were in this summer camp, they were all very, very similar. They came from like the same general city area. They were the same socioeconomic status. They were all white. They were all Protestant. So they were very much all similar to one another. Essentially, in many contexts, they would become an in-group. But we'll see how what happened in this Rattlers versus Eagles experiment shows us a lot of similarities to what we see group and country-wide and culture-wide for prejudice and discrimination. And then and that was the first part. That's the first part of the study. But then the really important part is how do we get rid of prejudice? How do we get rid of discrimination? And we'll focus in on that. But to begin with, these kids basically all the same. They could be interchanged into either of these groups, which later became known as the Rattlers or the Eagles, basically two different camps that didn't know about each other, all with the same kind of kids.
Between 1949 and 1954, social psychologist Musafar Sharif and Carolyn Wood Sharif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sharif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sharif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, They were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sheriff believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Musafar and Carolyn Sheriff had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
So in this example, we see that these kids were all essentially the same when they came together. They didn't know about each other, they were in separate areas, and they became their own social groups. They became in-groups. So they were the Rattlers and the Eagles. Then they were introduced to one another, they were put in competition with one another, they had limited resources, and so these social psychology principles that we've been talking about, in-group, out-group, attributions about the other members of the group, prejudices, attitudes, even discriminatory behaviors, fighting, hitting, burning flags. These are the same kinds of behaviors we see towards different groups today, that we see these kind of discriminatory behaviors. So hopefully you can see these clear parallels with these groups of kids. And one of the assumptions throughout this whole time, and through a lot of the research, was that simple contact between people, that just being there next to one another, eating next to each other, that kind of thing, would decrease prejudice and discrimination. We've seen now that there are some contexts where that can happen, but overall, one of the things that this showed and later evidence showed is that simple contact alone does not decrease the prejudice and discrimination. In reality, what needed to happen here was working together towards a common goal. And this is really good news, because this is something that we can do today as humans in the world, in workplaces, in schools, in teams. We can work together for a common goal. And the big thing here is that they had days of the kids together in the same area, doing things that were non-competitive, and they did not see the discrimination or the prejudice decrease. But once they had to do things together, once they had superordinate goals, is what the video called them. Another way to talk about that is goals that they have to do together. So the movie that they were going to watch, they couldn't afford to rent it by themselves. One group alone couldn't do it. They had to do it together. Another example is the water tank. So the researchers it created a situation where the water tank broke and you had to have everybody working on it. So again, this was created by the researchers intentionally so that everybody would have to work together. So the Rattlers and the Eagles, they had to work together. Again, that truck didn't just get stuck. It was it was a manufactured sticking of the truck. But the kids had to work together to pull it out. They all had to tug of war together rather than tug of war apart to pull this truck out of the hole. So again, this was all manufactured so that these were goals that they had to do together. And it worked. The simple contact didn't reduce the prejudice, didn't reduce the discrimination, but working together for a common goal did. And we see that today, that this is the best way to reduce prejudice, discrimination, the not extrinsic, the explicit versus implicit attitudes towards groups as well. This is one of still the best ways to do this, is to work together for a common goal. This is something that some companies might do when putting together groups of people. If a HR person, for example, might know, or an IO psychologist at the company might know that someone has some prejudice or has even been discriminatory. Obviously, they're not going to say, put someone in harm's way and put, say, a really racist white person in a group with a black person when they know the white person might like physically attack the person, right? But if they know that they have some implicit attitudes, some prejudice, some biases, they might put them together to work on something that takes both of their skills. When doing the work together that requires both of your skills, that is when we see this prejudice and discrimination decrease. So there's a lot of things we can do in the world, a lot of ways we can work to make things better, a lot of problems to solve that we can work together for a common goal. With that being said, when you are working towards a common goal, you are in contact with the person, but you start to see the abilities and the talents of the person. You start to value that person as a human being, whereas before you might not have. So this changes attitudes, this changes beliefs, this might even give you cognitive dissonance, probably gives you cognitive dissonance as you are working through the process of realizing, oh, this person doesn't fit the stereotypes. Maybe other people in this group don't fit the stereotypes. So with that being said, it mentioned that the simple contact didn't decrease the prejudice and discrimination. We've seen in later studies that you can have simple contact work when the other is considered the same or higher status as you. So again, in that workplace example, even though you might be like the same level in the company, you might not actually consider that other person to be the same status as you. Maybe you've been there longer, whatever it might be, you might consider them to be lower status. In that kind of setting, when you are not working towards something, just simple contact, having your cubicles next to each other, if you don't see that person as the same status or higher status than you, it will not decrease the prejudice and discrimination. But if that, say, their boss is a member of a group they see as other, that would be someone they'd probably see as higher status. That would be a situation where we do see prejudice and discrimination decrease over time. So how do we get rid of this kind of implicit or automatic prejudice? A lot of it is automatic. So how do we get rid of it? Well, it first starts with recognizing these stereotype thoughts or impressions. So again, something like an implicit association test can help you with that, help you realize if you do have any implicit associations. If you have explicit ones and you want to change them, I'd recommend that you do try to do that. You can train new habits. You can realize when you're thinking negative thoughts towards a member of a group, when you're acting differently. You can use more cognitive energy to intentionally try to change new habits. Another thing to do, an exercise that you can do, is try to think specifically of individuals who you know of. You don't have to know them in person, right? But you can think of people in the other group that don't fit the stereotype. So if you know you have implicit or explicit attitudes towards a specific group, think about people that you know that don't fit it. If you think that a group is lazy, try to imagine a person that you know of that doesn't fit the stereotype. Right? It might be someone in popular media, an actor or something like that. That's totally fine. It might be someone you actually have met personally in your life, but think of examples of people that don't actually fit that stereotype. Another thing is you can seek out that contact with members of the group. Again, that tends to work better if it's intentional, if you are intentionally trying to learn about the person, learn from the person. and if they're equal or you see them as equal or higher status than you. So seeking out that contact can help too. But with this, the big thing is we can use these social forces to get rid of these kind of prejudice and discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. And working together for common goals is the thing that does it the best and lasts the longest and can work the quickest. So these social forces can be immensely powerful. They have some benefits to us, but they have a lot of negatives as well. So we can hack them to do good instead of harm. So with that, here's a list from your book of a bunch of types of social influence. Some of these that we've touched on more in detail. Some of these we haven't gone into much detail on. So conformity, compliance, obedience, groupthink, all of these things. And we'll get to some of them in a later slide. But here is a bunch of the types of social influence. Again, they can have good things to them or bad things to them, but we can also use them in good ways. So let's talk about pro-social behavior. Specifically, this is one of my favorite aspects of social psychology. A lot of the social psych work on pro-social behavior is kind of where heroism research was born. So this is something I know a lot about and something I like a lot. So pro-social behavior is simply any kind of voluntary behavior for the benefit of other people. So doing something nice for someone, sharing your ice cream, opening a door for someone, all the way to donating money. There's a lot of different forms of pro-social behavior. There's two kind of categories here. One is egoistic helping and one is altruistic helping. Egoistic is helping someone in exchange for something. Like you do this for me, I'll do this for you. We'll have a back and forth, or I'll do this for you because then I get a deduction on my taxes, right? So that would be egoistic helping. Altruistic helping is helping for the purpose of helping another person, just to increase the other person's welfare, helping because you want to help. Now, that being said, there's quite a lot of philosophy literature, quite a lot of psychology literature as well on does altruistic helping actually exist? And one of the main arguments, we're not going to dive too deep into that, but one of the main arguments is, well, a lot of times when you help someone, you get some benefit, right? Even if you're not intending to get a benefit, it still generally feels pretty good to help someone. And so, is there actually any true form of altruistic helping? Some people would say no, some people would say yes. So my advisor in grad school was of the egoistic helping, that helping can't actually be altruistic for a variety of reasons. One being that you do get some benefit to yourself, some even just little good feeling, like or fitting in with social norms, for example. And I'm of the view that altruistic helping does exist. So it took in all those years of grad school, never convinced them. They didn't convince me the other way. So it's totally fine to be on either side of those because in the end, does the reason behind the helping really matter? If the help is getting done, whether you're getting a benefit from it or whether it is altruistic, the helping is happening. People are getting helped. So that is what really matters here. That being said, feel free to dive down that rabbit hole if you're interested in it. It is one that's existed for a long time. But here we also have social norms around helping. So one is the norm of reciprocity, the idea that we should help people who also help us. If you've ever had, say, a neighbor help you out, give you a gift, take your trash can in, you probably thought, oh, I should probably take in their trash can next time, or I should take them a plate of cookies, or you should return the favor. It's a pretty common thing. Norm of social responsibility, the idea that we should help people who need help. So the social responsibility is very highly correlated with empathy, with pro-social behavior, even with heroism. So people who are high in social responsibility feel like they should do things for other people. You might have a teacher who has high social responsibilities, feels a sense of duty and obligation to his students. You can have people who feel just general social responsibility to people in their society. So even if that person on the side of the road is not someone that they actually know, they're a human. They're someone who needs help. So I'm responsible to help that person. That would be high social responsibility. The norm of social justice, that we should help those who deserve help. So that some people deserve help, some people we should be helped because they deserve it. Again, if we think back to the just world hypothesis, we might have an incorrect sense of who needs help, right? Maybe some people are getting what they deserve. So the norm of social justice, any of these norms can be kind of messed with other social factors too. But these are pretty common new norms for helping behavior. So another big area of research is bystander intervention. So do people help when there's other people around? There's a variety of evidence. Some of it early on we're seeing now as we look at the data was not that great. But we do see a little bit of an effect that when there's a lot of people around, bystanders, so when there's a big group of people, people will be a little less likely to help in a given situation. That being said, there are a lot of situations where the bystander effect doesn't happen, and we'll talk about those. One of those is when there is a very clear emergency. When there's a very clear thing, the action to be taken is very clear. Bystander effect doesn't tend to happen. So a lot of the early research really showed that the bystander effect happens all the time. A lot of that data we're seeing was a little bit cherry picked, which is unfortunate and leads to people to kind of mistrust psychology. But as we've got better methods and more truthful methodologies, more open science, we've seen that the bystander effect can happen. When there's a lot of people around us, we might tend to diffuse our responsibility to say, someone else is going to help, or I'm not skilled enough for this, someone else is probably better suited to helping in this situation. And that happens more and more if there's more people around, versus if we're the only one there, we might be more likely to help in that kind of situation. So with this, to intervene in any given helping situation, you first have to notice something is happening. You have to notice that something is needed. Help is needed in this situation. Then decide whether something, so you notice that something is needing to happen. You decide if something's wrong, and then you determine what kind of help is your responsibility, right? So how much of this is your responsibility to do? Do you need to intervene in this situation? So if you heard two people yelling at each other, maybe you decide that something is wrong and help is needed, but it's not your responsibility to intervene here. It's an example of you're maybe not going to intervene as a bystander. Then you've got to decide what kind of help you're going to offer. Are you going to call the police? Are you going to call the fire department? Are you going to gather people around to help someone out? Are you going to go in and like place bandages? Like decide what kind of help is needed and then implement that help. So what we see is that when situations are a little less clear, when it's not as clear what to do, people succumb to the bystander effect more often. When there are a lot of people around, it's a little more likely to succumb to the bystander effect. But there are a lot of situations where we don't have the bystander effect affect us. So especially when it's a really clear thing that this needs to be done, people will step in, which is really nice to see. Here's another interesting study that happened about the same time I was born. Kramer and colleagues in 1988 looked at college students and to see if they would help in this situation. So they took college students, they told them, they lied to them and said, hey, we're going to do a study on perception. You're going to look at shapes, see if you can see differences between shapes and colors, this kind of thing. But in reality, they were testing bystander effect and if a couple variables had to do with it. So some of these college students were just general college students. Some of these college students were training to be nurses. So they'd had at least 2 classes in the nursing program at this point. So they weren't certified nurses. They weren't ready to be working in hospitals, but they had a little bit of training. So it would be as if they were in, say, their 3rd quarter of school and had 1 nursing course in the first 2 quarters. So with that, as an example, they took all of these people and they walked them to the experimental room, and on the way, they pointed out that right outside the door, there was a worker working on a light fixture. So they were on a ladder way up there, and to make it really clear that this was happening, the experimenter would say, sorry that they're in the way, this just broke, it has to be fixed, to make it sure that it's very obvious that there was someone out there on a ladder. So then they were placed in a couple different rooms. They were placed in a room with a bunch of other people, or they were placed in a room with no other people. And so this was a good test of the bystander effect. So we had about half the participants with no training in the room with lots of people, half the participants with no training in the room with no people, half the participants with some training in the room with people, half the participants with training in the room with no people, to test bystander effect as well as does this special training affect their likelihood of helping. So a couple minutes later into doing this pretend perception task, so 3 minutes in, They heard a crash. The experimenter pushed over the ladder. The person on the ladder was already off, so they played a tape recorded message of the person yelling and screaming that they were hurt and that they needed help. And so they wanted to see what would happen. Who would help? And so what they saw was that the people with the special training, people with first aid training, people with any kind of training were more likely to help. So no matter which room that they were in, people with training in the bystander room, people with training in the room with no one, they were equally likely to help. Almost all of them went to help when they had a little bit of training. So special training can overcome the bystander effect. For the people who didn't have any training, they were more likely to help when they were on their own in the room than in the room with the bystanders. So the bystander effect did apply to them a little bit, but there were still members in this room that still did go to help. So the bystander effect happened when they didn't have special training, but not drastically. There were still people who did try to help. So yeah, this really shows us that special training can overcome or cancel out the bystander effect. All the participants, when asked later on, felt like they should do something to help. People with special training felt the self-efficacy, felt like they had some idea of what should be done. They felt more confident to act. So that is a big piece of pro-social action and heroic action, is this self-efficacy. Another study did something really similar. So they looked at people with emergency training. I think they had like two fairly short first aid classes. And then they came back and they did a similar kind of situation. Someone collapsed in front of them. Who would help? People who went to the special training class or people who went to an unrelated class? And the people with special training were way more likely to help. So again, bystander effect doesn't happen for if you've got special training. Bystander effect, it doesn't happen when the emergency is very clear. So while the bystander effect is a thing, there are ways that we can train ourselves to work around it so that we are helpers when needing to be helpers. And this goes along with whistleblowers as well. If you've ever started a new job and got, say, ethics training, maybe you went through, say, a PowerPoint or a couple of videos where it asked you questions and you thought, oh, this is, especially if you weren't getting paid for the training, oh, why do I have to do this kind of thing? Interestingly, even those kinds of trainings or trainings specifically about ethics or training specifically about how to report ethical violations, increase actual reporting, increase intention to report. So remember the intended intention related to behavior and theory of planned behavior, both reporting and intention, and your confidence in reporting. So training helps whistleblowers. Having supports for whistleblowers as well to help them know what to do really helps also. So these kinds of things can overcome the bystander effect and lead to both pro-social and even heroic actions. So heroism here, we've already talked about pro-social behavior generally. This is voluntary action to help other people. So that's the big umbrella or big bubble of pro-social behavior. Under that bubble of pro-social behavior, altruism. Helping others only because you're concerned for others, you want to help them. That is altruism specifically. And then heroism is an even smaller bubble. It's altruism plus risk. So you put yourself at risk for the benefit of others because you are concerned for the others. So it's altruism plus risk is what heroism is. You are putting yourself at risk to benefit others. So it's a type of pro-social behavior, but it's a little more specific of a type of pro-social behavior. So I could talk about heroism for a lot of time, and I do generally. So if you're interested in that, feel free to come to office hours or send me an email or check out the Heroic Imagination Project, which I'm part of. And we do a lot of things around heroism and pro-social behavior. So with this, a couple more points in social psychology that are in your book. A few of these with the time that we have, I want to go over just very, very briefly. And looking at my settings, I hope that the video I put downloaded well because I might have had the audio settings incorrect. But that's beside the point. So the book very, very briefly goes over different cultures. Different cultures have an impact on the social roles, the social norms, the way that we take in and learn and develop our attitudes over time. So we see one big thing is that in individualistic cultures like the US, we tend to make attributions about the dispositions of people, internal attributions, versus in collectivist cultures, we tend to make more situational attributions, so the outside environment. An example of this in pro-social behavior is that in the Western world, in individualist cultures and the US, we tend to see the most important or the best, the highest value pro-social behavior is when you do good for somebody without them asking. With you see something is needed, you see something would be good for someone, and then you do it without anybody being aware or talking to you about it. That is one thing that we see is really good. If someone saw some need and just did it, that's really applaudable. There's another word I'm looking for, good of that person to do. Versus in collectivist cultures, it's a little bit the opposite. The best form of pro-social behavior for a lot of collectivist cultures is if you are asked to help, that you do help, that you do the thing that is needed for the people that asked you. Again, both of these are pro-social. You asked for help and you help, or you saw there was a need and you help. They're both pro-social, but it's an interesting difference between cultures. So with that, we're not going to spend a lot of time on different social experiments. A lot of the points we've covered that were learned from some of these social experiments, but the Ash conformity study basically took participants, showed them this line, and then there were some Confederates that were asked, hey, which line does this line up with? If you can't tell, this is actually number C or letter C. But the rest of the people in front of them would say, oh, it's A, it's A, it's A. And so oftentimes the person would conform to the group. So oftentimes the person, even though they thought it looked like C, they would change their answer to what the group was doing. And group conformity can be really useful. Here's a good group conformity. They're here probably at something like the DMV. Rather than actually standing up in line, they put their shoes there, and that is where the line is. So you can see how this could be ruined by someone not conforming to the social rule and just coming and standing up in line and taking the place. That would not be conforming to this rule. In this case, the conformity is useful. If you're conforming to something that is negative, it could be really negative though. So another couple example is maybe as you're driving, you see a bunch of cars slowing down, so you slow down as well. And maybe the reason that was because you didn't know, but there was a dog in the road, and so everybody went slower around the dog. If you see a bunch of people outside of a room looking up at the sky, you're probably going to look up at the sky. Groups might know more than us. And so even in the Ash conformity study, a lot of people said, well, maybe I didn't understand the instructions very well. Maybe they saw something I didn't. The group might know something that you don't. So this is why conformity can be useful. It can help us not run over dogs in our cars, but it can lead to some negative things if we're conforming to unethical kinds of standards or rules. So normative social influence also, we don't want people to see us as weird. We want people to like us. We'll often use the same slang. We'll wear similar clothes, adopt the attitudes of a group. We'll kind of fit in with the social norm that exists. And again, that can be positive. It can boost our self-esteem. We're part of a group. We can learn things from other people, bounce things off of other people, get identity from people and compare things. But it can also lead to negative influences. That is kind of the point of the movie Mean Girls, is that this kind of conformity to this group, and then by the end, at the end of graduating, they had a norm in the school of everybody working together versus having such separate cliques, and they could see in the end that there were new upcoming freshmen that were very cliquey still. So with that being said, that's conformity. A Milgram study on obedience basically took an experimenter over here. So sorry if my face is covering part of this, but there's an experimenter who was telling you as a participant, the teacher, to ask questions to the learner. If the learner got the question right, nothing happens. You just go to the next question. If the learner got the question wrong, you shock the person with this shock generator. Now, the shock generator was real in a sense that it made a shock, and you as the learner, you as the teacher would feel the shock at the beginning, But in the end, the learner was not actually being shocked. It was either tape recording or acted. And so in the end, a lot of the learners did obey the experimenter and shock all the way to the end of the shock, even if the person was acting or the tape recording was playing, that the person was having heart problems, that they weren't able to continue. And so obedience can be very bad, right? It can be helpful. So obedience to things in the group might be very beneficial. But if the authority is making very unethical demands, you might get an argument like, I was just following orders, or that's just what I was told to do. I hope that you see that connection with some historical examples, like defenses that a lot of Nazis made, that I was just following orders. I was just obeying what I was told to do. And that doesn't cut it. So, didn't cut it in trial. It is a bad example of how obedience can be used in a negative way. So, with that being said, the key takeaway is people didn't know how they could or should respond in Milgram's specific study. The normative information suggested that they should behave the experimenter. It gives an opportunity to deny responsibility, blame it on the experimenter, say, I was just following orders. They also had a very limited time to think about the decision. So these additional variables can make obedience to negative things, unethical behaviors, more likely. That being said, we see some of this happen in real life with whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, oftentimes, they have more time than people did in Milgram's study to think about, well, what should I actually do? Oh, I just found out that this unethical thing is happening. What should my next steps be? So they have some more time. They might even have some examples of people who did blow the whistle beforehand, but it is usually still a novel thing. They still have the opportunity that they could just ignore it, be like, I'm going to blame it on them. I'm just going to do my job and I'm going to continue on. Interestingly, there's a hero that I've interviewed, that he is a accountant, like works with money and things for banks. So, in a bank that he was working at, he realized one of the higher ups was embezzling a lot of money. And so he whistle blew. He called him out on it. He was fired. For a while, he was even blacklisted. In the end, he was right, and the person did have to pay a fine or go to jail for a little bit of time. But after this, he was hired at another bank where one of the people that hired him was doing the same behavior. So it wasn't so novel that second time. He already knew the kind of routes to go through. He had contacts in, say, government to talk about, oh, this is what's happening. And so he again blew the whistle in the same kind of situation for a bank, which is, I think, is a really funny story. And it's overall not very funny because it's terrible couple of years both times going through this whole process. Even some of the legal processes weren't finished when I was interviewing, even though the specific events happened like 8 years ago and even before then. So with that, he had the opportunity to blame and just ignore it, shovel it under the rug, leave that cognitive dissonance alone, but took action. So people can do the right thing, even in the face of this pressure of obedience, conformity, even if they are at risk. So that's one of the reasons whistleblowers are one of the heroes I admire so much. Because yes, I definitely admire people who take a physical risk, pull someone from a burning car. And that's a huge risk. You could lose your life. Absolutely. And people have. There are people who definitely have lost their lives pulling people from burning cars, from frozen rivers. People have lost their lives. So long-term effect, right? Whistleblowers, oftentimes, they have to make this decision to continue to act heroically over and over and over again. So it's very impressive to me. All right, the last one is a Stanford prison study. So this one we had actually one of the starting points of heroism research, Philip Zimbardo, who created a study where he had participants who acted as guards and as prisoners to see what would happen in that kind of situation. There were a lot of methodological problems with this study. There was a lot of kind of creating social norms intentionally, whereas an experimenter should have been completely removed from the setting, encouraging specific behaviors. So it's not a good study methodologically. It was really harmful to the participants, But it did show that personal identity can be eroded, that sense of personal responsibility, that sense of social responsibility, by this kind of de-individualization. Oftentimes we will act uninhibited because we believe no one can identify us. You can see that in behaviors online with bullying, things like that. Uh, with this, we see this in, say, the Ku Klux Klan. Wearing these hoods and these outfits, they're de-individualized. You don't know who any given individual is in that group. So while the study has some serious methodological problems, it did show some of the power of de-individualization as well as dehumanization. So still useful things to be learned from these studies. All right, and the last thing in your chapter is Sternberg's triarchic theory of love. So a very drastic shift from some of these social psych experiments. Sternberg's triarchic theory of love is a really good model to compare the kind of relationships you might want to have in your life. So the three key parts of this are passion, intimacy, and commitment. For passion, what we mean there is basically physical and sexual attraction. Do you want to sleep with this person? If the answer is yes, you've got passion there. Intimacy is very specifically defined. Oftentimes, when just a layperson says intimacy, they're often kind of conflating it also with passion. For this definition in this model in social psych, we're talking about feelings of emotional warmth and closeness. I feel intimate with that person. I've shared my deep desires with them. They've shared their fears with me. I've shared my fears with them. I've told them my favorite book. They've told me their favorite book. We share these ideas with each other where this is important to us. I care about them because we've shared a lot about ourselves. So again, the passion, the sexual desire is a completely separate thing. Then the intimacy is sharing things and feeling that warm connection with that person that you're sharing things with. So commitment is maybe a little easier to understand. It is that you want to maintain the relationship even if problems occur. You'll be there for the person, they'll be there for you. These commitments can be big or small, right? At the beginning of a relationship, when you're just, say, starting to date someone, a date would be an example of a commitment. You've set something. You want to do something. You'll be there for that date. It could be all the way up to something like getting married or having children, moving in together, buying a house together, buying a Mazda together. These kinds of things are examples of commitment. So each of these types of love are love on their own. You have intimacy alone. You might have a relationship that's entirely built on the warm feelings that you have because you are sharing things with them. They're sharing things with you. You talk a lot, this kind of thing. You might have a relationship that is exclusively passion alone, that you just want to have sex with them. They just want to have sex with you. You don't care at all about intimacy and sharing things about yourself or them sharing things about you, and you don't even have any commitments. So you might later build some more commitments. Maybe you want to see them again for sex, but we're just focusing on the corners right now. And the other one, commitment, you can see it's also called empty love, which is kind of a sad definition, but some of the examples here can be a little bit sad and empty in some forms. So let's imagine a situation where you are very committed to a person. You will be there for them no matter what. And the good example of a way this could happen is maybe you have an aging parent or grandparent, and you know that they, because of a neurodegenerative illness, they're not actually going to be able to share any intimacy with you. They're not going to share about themselves. Maybe they don't even recognize or know you anymore, but you are committed to that person. You will do things for them. You're going to be taking them to the doctor's appointments. You're going to be giving them their medicine. That would be an example of commitment alone. And it is a hard thing for sure for people. But yeah, those three pieces make up all these other aspects of love. So with that, these three dimensions, passion, intimacy, commitment, they all lead to these other forms of love. So consummate love is usually what you want with a long-term partner. It's considered the fullest form of love. It's including passion, intimacy, and commitment. So it's this one right here in the middle. If you went to a marriage and family therapist, that's the one they're probably going to be wanting to see. Do you have that? Why don't you have that? Is there a lack of passion? Are you not sleeping with each other? Do you not want to sleep with each other? Why is that? Let's work on that. Or maybe you don't have this consummate love because you're not sharing things with each other. You don't feel warm towards each other, and you're not doing things that lead to intimacy and sharing about things in your life. Or maybe it's your lacks of commitments. Maybe you're kind of living two separate lives right now, that kind of thing. So a marriage and family therapist would figure out which one of these you are lacking in, and then try and figure out how you can boost that aspect of love. So that would be consummate love. That's generally what we would expect to see for long-term commitments to people that are a partner, for example. But another big one, well, okay, not big one. I thought my slides are in a different order than I thought. So let's go to infatuation next. So infatuation is when you have passion and no intimacy and commitment, which we talked about already with passion alone. And then affectionate love, companionate love. So this one, affectionate love or companionate love over here, is one that is probably the most common in most people's lives. So try to think before I give any examples who you might have companionate love with. So people that you have commitments to, whether small or big, people that you have intimacy with, that you feel warmth towards, that you're sharing things about you, they're sharing things about them. But people, the key part here is these are not people you want to sleep with. So that's kind of the key part here. Who do you have intimacy with? You're sharing things about yourself. They're sharing things about them. You know about them. They know about you. You see them regularly. You're doing things regularly, but you don't want to sleep with them. Pause the video, write down some examples of people in your life who you have or you would want companionate love with. So hopefully you've got a couple examples. A lot of people in your life would probably fall under the companionate love. If you have friends that you don't want to sleep with, there might be friends that you want to sleep with. That would probably be including the passion. But a lot of your friends, the ones that you just want to hang out with, talk with, do things with, but not sleep with, companionate love. There you go. Your siblings, if you have siblings, probably want to have companionate love. Share things about themselves. You share things about yourselves. You'll be there for them if they need help. You'll be there for Thanksgiving, these kinds of things. Companionate love would probably apply to parents, children, grandparents. A lot of relationships in our life are probably wanting to have companionate love, some form of commitment with that person, that you'll be there for them in some capacity, that you will share things about yourself, they share things about themselves. A lot of our relationships are companionate love, which is really fantastic form of love. All of these can be positive overall. But again, companionate love, the piece that it's missing is no passion. You're not wanting to sleep with that person. Right? So if we look here on the left side, I kind of consider this side the rom-com side of the Sternberg-Schreierkrich theory of life. A lot of rom-coms start with people sharing things about themselves, and then over the course of the movie, they realize, oh, they do want to sleep with each other. And then usually by the end of the movie, after the part like 2/3 the way through where there's the drama and it looks like they're going to break up, what's going to happen? They make some sort of commitment. So they're kind of moving towards consummate love. So passion might be how it starts in the rom-com, and then they actually start to know things about each other. And they're like, oh, we actually do like each other. So it's now romantic love, and then it, again, might lead to consummate love. So romantic love is that passion and intimacy. Oftentimes, if we're thinking about a new dating relationship, that's probably where we are at the beginning. You probably want to sleep with that person, you're sharing things with that person, but other than like some dates, you're probably not moving into any kind of commitment yet. So that would be what romantic love is. Fatuous love here at the bottom, that is adding that passion and commitment. Some examples of this is it could be seen as a commitment to have a regular friend with benefits who you don't actually share intimacy with. You don't really share anything other than sex with them, and you meet them regularly. That would be an example. I often think that The Bachelor, I do like watching The Bachelor, is an example of fatuous love. That there's a lot of passion there. Clearly, these people want to sleep with each other. They're getting engaged. They're making a pretty significant commitment. But how much do they actually know about each other after going on a handful of dates? I think they probably have only actually known each other a total of, I don't know, like 20 hours or maybe they go on a couple bigger dates. So maybe they've known each other like 40 hours total. I don't know that there's that much intimacy yet. And I think a lot of those examples are fatuous love. But hopefully you can see from this model that you can kind of pinpoint the kinds of love that you want in your life. So with your friends, are you wanting companionate love? Are you feeling like it's not all the way there? Well, is it intimacy that you're missing there? Do you need to share more with them? Do they need to share more with you? How do you work on that? Is it commitment? Have you both been too busy at work to actually get a hangout going? Right? There's things that you can kind of pinpoint if you have a long-term partner that you want consummate love with. Well, consider, well, what is it? Is it a lack of passion? Is it a lack of intimacy? Is it a lack of commitment? And you can work on that. Again, if you go to a marriage and family therapist, they can help you through those things as well. So that is the end of chapter 12. Hopefully you found a lot of things in this chapter that are really useful for you as you're considering relationships and considering how also we can work on decreasing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, as well as prosocial behavior. As a final reminder, I say this a lot of the time, but make sure you're checking your syllabus for what the next chapter you're supposed to be reading is, because depending on the quarter, it can be different. So check your syllabus.